Good day everyone, and welcome back to the channel. It's Londononion here with our first Back 4 Blood Cleaner Synergy analysis. Now it is important to first state the parameters and limitations before undergoing our analysis. As we are all aware, deck builds are essentially the cornerstone of Back 4 Blood, and given the various combinations they can be arranged in, some of our talking points will inherently be rife with nuance and open to alternative opinion. But this is not meant to be a dogmatic presentation. Next, a major part of evaluating synergy will also be centered on acts, and of course the levels that make them up, each of which requiring different strategies for optimal progression depending on difficulty and corruptions. Lastly, for those that were present for our cleaner role-based deck builds, a good portion of today's discussion will be based on our earlier interpretations of each cleaner's meta, as well as incorporating their role designations and the associated implications. I highly recommend checking out that playlist, which should be available now. Now our discussion will be broken up into two main segments. First, we will go over our selected act and evaluate each level based on main areas of difficulty, or MAD for short. The second part of our discussion will aim to determine the optimal team of cleaners to take on said act, while taking into consideration their meta, associated with deck builds, and their potential for synergy. So in order to determine applicable synergy, this is an aspect based mostly on acts and levels. For today's discussion, we'll be focusing on the first act of Back 4 Blood, and we will also assume that difficulty will either be that of Nightmare or No Hope. In this Onion's opinion, anything that can be performed on the higher difficulties can be performed on the lower difficulties, but with far fewer hindrances and more liberties. Now I will break down levels into three main areas of difficulty, or MADs for short, and they will be termed as longevity, crescendo events, and the most versatile of them all, corruption cards. To go through them briefly, longevity naturally refers to how long a given stage is. By extension, this could also include having a series of objectives to be completed before a given safe room should become available. Crescendo events refer to targeted moments during a stage that forces a team into a horde circumstance that either requires progression to a checkpoint/safe room or the deactivation of an environmental feature. By extension, I will also include hazards with this constituent of difficulty. Lastly, corruption cards have the least predictability, but generally include bosses, enhanced ridden, challenges, and bonus objectives. These ultimately feed into the rest of the difficulty points and can augment enemies, nerf cleaners in a variety of ways, or create rules with the promise of a bonus upon fulfillment, which may increase longevity. Now, each of these MADs naturally have their own countermeasures to maximize the odds of success for a given cleaner team. It is also imperative to state that there will be some overlap among them. Hordes, for example, tend to occur with the presence of bosses, and longer levels are more likely to have a greater amount of hazards, but nothing is set in stone. So first, we will go through an evaluation of level difficulty points and then transition into what I consider to be the ideal cleaner team, or at least one ideal cleaner team, based on my determination of their role-based builds and synergy. Starting off with Stage 1, Resurgence. As the first stage, there aren't many difficulty points, but we will go through them with objectivity. In terms of longevity, the stage is rather straightforward, of getting from one point to another without any alternative convoluted objectives. Additionally, because of the crampy layout, there is inherently a smaller volume of ridden. The stage only comes with one crescendo event and can technically be avoided with the use of a toolkit. Undergoing the crescendo event, however, triggers a horde for a short period of time. As for corruptions, on the higher difficulties, ridden usually have one or more enhancements, while there is the potential of a roaming boss while on No Hope. Moving on to Tunnel of Blood, the main difficulty lies in the crescendo corner, particularly with hordes and a predetermined boss that emerges twice, unless you're able to kill it from the first emergence. Longevity is relatively moderate. There are technically no crescendo events, and corruption card distribution is virtually similar to that of Resurgence. Pain Train has moderate longevity, one major crescendo event that requires fighting through a continuous horde, hazards are limited to crows, and few alarmed doors. Bonuses may include limiting incapacitations, finding a specimen container, or nerfing cleaner health/recovery. This stage usually comes with a boss corruption card, and there may be increased likelihood of encountering hordes of mutations or enhanced mutations. Next, the Crossing is pretty much a crescendo event in and of itself, with above moderate longevity due to the extra objective of planting explosives. Bosses are also a possibility on No Hope, and corruption cards will increase in count and accumulated potency. A Clean Sweep is a small map, but is compensated with multiple objectives. There are 2 crescendo events, 1 boss, and corruptions are rather typical, enhancing both Ridden and mutations. A common challenge is not triggering any hazards or finding a specimen container. Bookworms has above moderate longevity. The stage itself is not painfully big, but it does have multiple objectives in different areas, and will consistently come with a timed horde in the first segment. There is 1 crescendo event, no predetermined bosses, however corruption cards may add a boss. Barroom Blitz is another crescendo stage, but with a minimal demand on mobility, but more so defense and attrition. Special Delivery has low longevity with 1 simple yet extra objective, a high amount of hazards, and will likely come with a boss corruption, no hazards challenge, and enhanced Ridden. The Diner is another crescendo stage, similar to Barroom Blitz, but will also come with a boss while on higher difficulties. Longevity is moderate. There are no additional objectives other than carrying a supplies box to the end. The stage itself is relatively small, but the final objective is a battle of attrition. Next, Bad Seeds I would consider to have high longevity. It comes with extra objectives, the stage is quite wide and lengthy, and corruption challenges and bonuses will vary from one run to another. Crescendo themes will also be common in completing objectives. There is a final crescendo event requiring mobility through a continuous horde. Hazards are frequent, and Ridden/mutations tend to have monstrous corruptions. Hell's Bells I would say has high longevity, mainly due to the size of the map itself, as well as the surprise objective within the safe room. It's common for corruptions to demand no hazards triggered, which will act as a natural hindrance to stage progression. There are 2 crescendo events, 1 guaranteed hag, and strong corruptions on Ridden and mutations. Abandoned has high longevity, not only because of the lengthy design, but also because of multiple objectives. This stage is also rife with crescendo events, 3 to be exact. The last one is easily the most difficult, as the horde is continuous, and its difficulty is contingent on closing spawn points or rushing past them. Not to mention, the hordes are quite large. A boss is also a likely occurrence. Lastly, the Sound of Thunder, being a finale, has only 1 aspect of longevity, and that is the main objective. It is mainly crescendo based, and comes with a boss, but if you ask me, is mainly dependent on superior use speed and defense tactics. With all of that said, we can now move on to the Cleaner Synergy segment. Again, for those that were present for our role-based deck builds, each cleaner was evaluated on their core skills, given a role designation, and a deck build to enhance their abilities or compensate for their shortcomings with discretion. But as I tend to state, I like specializing builds more than compensatory builds. As for team composition, I would argue the opposite. I would assert that diversity in skill set is greater than homogeny as a whole. With that said, looking at our role designations, I would say each cleaner team will require an Alpha, Major, Minor, and Omega for optimal progression. Speaking briefly on these roles, the Alpha is the chief navigator of a given team, and the first responder to threats and hazards with a relatively generalized skill set to deal with said threats. The Major acts as the leader's support and the Minor's bodyguard. They pay attention to areas the Alpha does not, take the lead where their skills are more appropriate, and act as a strong defense against Ridden for the sake of the Minor. The Minor is the team's supportive hub and/or designated healer. Keeping their team alive and well is first priority. Offense is only to be used in self-defense or where there is extra firepower needed. The Omega acts as the team's anchor and rear protection. They are the final defense that does not fall if everybody else does, whether that be through superfluous defensive or offensive capabilities. They may also stand as substitute for other roles if needed. As touched on earlier, each of the areas of difficulty naturally have their countermeasures. Levels with high longevity usually will have a high demand on ammunition and will increase the amount of stress health reserves are put under. The natural countermeasure is a cleaner with either a diversified skill set or one that naturally has contingencies for ammo and health preservation. Lastly, mobility may also help with longevity, particularly with completing objectives and reaching key points. Though I would not argue that it's suitable for long period use, as that seems akin to speedrunning, which I'm not the biggest supporter of in a team-based game. Next, crescendos in this Onion's opinion have a countermeasure with the use of high defenses, use of melee weapons / close quarters combat, mobility, and having an edge in maintaining temporary health. Corruptions, being the least predictable yet still equally problematic in manifesting difficulty, have the least concrete countermeasures. Due to the nature of corruptions, the only logical countermeasure is having a well-diversified and synergized team to deal with whatever corruptions may be issued in their direction. As discussed in our role designations, our alpha cleaners are Walker, Evangelo, Carly, and Heng. Majors are Holly, possibly Charisse, possibly Hoffman, and perhaps Walker. Minors are Doc, Mom, and Prophet Dan. Lastly, Omegas are Jim, Charisse, and Hoffman. Now I would argue that team composition starts with the Alpha. Based on the Alpha's build, attributes, and loadout, the rest will follow. For this discussion, I decided to go with Evangelo. He is a cleaner of mobility and stamina, with a build that adds health preservation and minor amounts of general damage. His loadout is oriented toward SMGs and any secondary of choice. When speaking on longevity, map size and objectives are easily handled due to his mobility, stamina, and economical primary weapon. He's neutral with common corruptions and challenges, and falls short with mutations and bosses, especially when corrupted. Hordes and hazards are also neutral depending on context. No one escapes a horde like Evangelo, but nobody triggers hordes as easily as him either. Taking this evaluation into account, a major that excels in crescendos and/or mutations and bosses would aid in a more complete frontal defense. Looking at our pool, I employ Walker for the major position. His skills and deck build directly make up for a portion of Evangelo's shortcomings. I have Walker constructed as the general damage expert, and he has some defenses in his corner. His card selections, such as Confident Killer, March for Death, and Avenge the Fallen, aid his entire team in combat prowess and ultimately survival. His loadout is ideally with rifle caliber rounds with any range secondary of choice. Outside of support items, his card selections don't do much in replenishing health. Based on his build, however, crescendos cannot be sustained for long periods of time, as he can be an ammo-heavy cleaner if forced into the correct circumstances. In terms of longevity, I would say Walker is neutral. His success mainly comes down to ammo management, as he is a combatively effective cleaner, but a stage too long could stress said reserves too much. The same can be said about crescendos. Hordes are not necessarily a problem, but too many, or a continuous crescendo without firm progression, will dry him out. As for corruptions, because of Walker's generally effective ability, I would argue that he will fare well against whatever enhanced mutations, ridden, or bosses the director may issue toward him. Moving on to the Omega position, I skipped Minor, since they typically aren't offensively oriented, but will return to them real soon. The Omega position is somewhat of a toss-up between Hoffman and Charisse, because with the way both are built, they can taper off the team's effectiveness in one direction or another. Hoffman would greatly increase offensive prowess by providing ammo, enhanced throwables, and ultimately versatility, especially in the face of bosses. Charisse would add a tough layer of defense, add diversification with a greater orientation to melee weapons, and ease the amount of stress placed on the Minor, since her build allows her to heal herself, at least in the face of a horde. Speaking from a synergy perspective, however, I would go with Hoffman, as he would be able to aid the rest of his team with ammo maintenance, throwables, and can effectively stand as substitute for the major position. Charisse, though very good with defense and mutation deterrence, she is far less effective with bosses, which would double down on Evangelo's weakness, leaving Walker as the main deterrent. Charisse would be more effective with continuous hordes, though Hoffman can also perform similarly, just not with melee weapons. Hoffman's preferred loadout would be a shotgun and an LMG for versatility. The choice of Minor is more dependent on level demands, team maturity, and capabilities. I would argue that stages with greater longevity and lower crescendos would fit more of a Doc type of Minor. Greater crescendos and less longevity, I would say Mom. Both longevity and crescendos, I would say either Mom or Prophet Dan, though none of this is set in stone. Now loadout I won't really speak much on, since Minors are intended to be the least offensively oriented role. Generally, however, I would say Minors should stick with either an ammo type not being used or one with higher economy. But looking at our first two cleaners, Evangelo can somewhat support himself. Walker will likely require some aid over time. Based on the layout of Act 1, the earlier groups of stages have relatively shorter crescendo events with moderate longevity on average. Both longevity and crescendo seem to increase commensurately, especially upon reaching Blue Dog Hollow. With that said, looking at our team composition, because of the heavy firepower granted by both Walker and Hoffman, mobility and self-preservation of Evangelo, as well as the stamina and movement boosts he provides through his core skills and deck build, longevity seems to be covered. There is also enough firepower to handle bosses and mutations regardless of their corruptions. Hordes, by extension, can also be handled. Now with this said, both Hoffman and Walker don't have much as far as health preservation goes, and this can be particularly difficult with the right corruption cards. So for the Minor, I would employ Doc. Out of the pool of Minors, Doc is the least offensively oriented, so it would make sense to place her with more offensively capable cleaners. Plus, according to our Mad Matrix, she would only be able to suffice for some corruption challenges and cleaner nerfs. Since she has no offense-based cards, everything about her is restorative, and this is the exact gap Walker and Hoffman would need fulfilled, with Evangelo as an occasional cleaner in need. So there we have it. Evangelo as alpha and longevity expert. His stamina, mobility, and ammo economy allows him to be a fair first response to common threats, with an uncanny ability to evade and reach checkpoints / complete objectives as needed. Walker, one of the more offensively capable cleaners, as Major, his high general damage makes lighter work of mutations and bosses, while his generalized skill set neutralizes ridden and mutation-based corruptions. Doc as Miner can provide a permanent means of healing trauma and health, where other cleaners are less capable of doing so. Plus, with 2 ranged powerhouses, she doesn't need much offense anyway, and will be less of an ammo sink. Lastly, Hoffman as the Omega provides for the rest of his team with additional ammo and throwables. He also has versatility with his weapon loadout. Looking at our role spectrum as well, we have Hoffman, who falls in the center of the destructive plane, Walker on the pragmatic plane with mixed offense and defense, while Doc and Evangelo were classified as supportive defense. In terms of composition and diversity, this team covers the board in a reasonably balanced manner, but technically, this is all arbitrary and can be taken with a grain of salt. Now, Act 1 is quite lengthy, and to suggest that there is only one optimal team would be difficult for this onion to support. So we will definitely have some revisits in the future. Additionally, deck builds really boil down to the user, their playstyle, as well as the maturity of their team. But otherwise, this brings us to the end of our discussion today. Thank you guys oh so much for joining me on this one. And in our next videos, we have some housekeeping to catch up with, since there has been a new addition to the cleaner roster, as well as some new cards, which may alter some of our deck builds, though not too much. It's been Londononion, and I will see you guys next time.